Hello, friends. What if I told you that property prices fell by 60% during a 20-year period? Excuse me. What if I told you that property prices fell by 60% in 30 years? So there were periods of time in the past, not a very, very distant past, where the property prices went down by, again, 60%. When looking at 2 decades or 3 decades in two different examples. What am I talking about? Well, I've been obsessing about this book that I've read, and I told you about in my previous video, The Great Taking by David Rogers Webb, which I have to say shocked me. This is the book. That's the cover of the book. Once again, you can download it for free. The Great Taking is the name. So we're going to go to the section where I want to read you a passage. All right, so it's the chapter 9, The Great Deflation of this book. It says, so the author is recalling his grandpa and grandma buying a property at Shaker Heights in suburb of Cleveland in the US, Ohio. And this is what he says. Needless to say, I highly recommend you read this book. You pretty much must read it, to put it simply. So in 1923, Grandpa Rogers, the surgeon who had been in the first US medical unit into the Great War, bought 3 housing lots in Shaker Heights, a new upscale suburb of Cleveland. These properties would have gone up in value through the 20s. In 1929, the stock market crashed. He was probably quite glad that he had not sold the lots and put the money into the stock market. In 1933, when the banks were closed, he was probably quite glad that he had not sold the lots and put the money in the banks. In 1952, 3 decades later, his widow finally sold the lots for 1/3 of what Grandpa Rogers had paid for them in 1923. This was not because Shaker Heights was economically depressed in 1952. Shaker Heights was, in the 1950s and into the early 1960s, statistically the wealthiest suburb in the United States. I can kind of vouch for that because I told my aunt in the US who lives in Cleveland about this book, and I told her about Shaker Heights, and she said, the first thing she said, oh yeah, we know Shaker Heights. It's old money. They believe that Rockefellers come from Shaker Heights, and I'm not surprised that to be the case. So Cleveland is, to be polite, not much of a city today, but it was a great economical and industrial zone. It was very well developed. It was wealthy. So the price didn't go down so much because, like the author says, because Cleveland lost all the industry. The industry was still pumping in the 50s and 60s. But what happened is there was a deflation. So this has actually happened in the past. There's no denying it. This is what happened. But if we think that this is maybe an isolated case, again, something to do with Cleveland, which it clearly isn't, this passage, or I'm going to skip a paragraph and go down to the next. The second paragraph after that is that the further confirmation of the persistence of the deflation is found in the paper by Tom Nicholas and Anna Sherbina, titled Real Estate Prices During the Roaring 20s and the Great Depression. So this is what that paper says. Using unique data on real estate transactions, we construct nominal and CPI adjusted hedonic price indices for Manhattan from 1920 to 1939. So that's 2 decades. The CPI adjusted index falls during the recession that followed World War I, rises to a local peak in 1926, again, not a surprise, and declines again following the collapse of the Florida real estate bubble. It subsequently recovers to reach its highest value in the late 1920s. That was the peak of the stock market as well, before falling by 74% at the end of 1932 and hovering around that value until 1939. A typical property bought in the beginning of 1920 would have retained only 40% of its initial value 2 decades later. This is actually very interesting. Of course, it's very interesting to everyone, but more to the point, I actually thought, all right, so if one is to expect this, the great taking, which predicts a great deflation and a great reset by the powers, then you would probably want to consolidate your properties. Say, I'll give you a scenario where someone has, property portfolio of 5 properties in Australia. That seems to be not a rare occurrence, but at least maybe 2 or 3, and they leveraged properties. Why they leverage? Because most people leverage so they can do the negative gearing, so they can get a tax benefit on the loss on their interest rate loss and other depreciation and losses. So it's very beneficial to do negative gearing with the mortgage, to have those properties under mortgage. Otherwise, it's really not worth it. There's no point. So let's assume that these hypothetical, let's bring it down to reality, maybe like 3 properties are leveraged. The person is doing the the negative gearing to maximize their tax return. And they read this book that says, you know what, they're preparing a crash. They want to take all the securities, all the cash in the bank, all the bonds, all the shares, so securities, and all the property that is leveraged, that has a mortgage attached to it, including all the cars. They want to, and they're planning to do this before 2030, because remember, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. So if we believe this author, who, by the way, many have tried to rebut, but his information seems to be rock solid. One says, okay, I'm going to sell those properties. Well, I'm going to sell 2 properties and then settle the debt for the 3rd property, so I'll be debt free. Why they're not going to do it and why it's so hard to do it? Because they got sucked in. They got sucked into buying all these properties, leverage them, and then not being able to sell it at a real profit. Bear with me here. So this hypothetical person sells those 2 properties, and what does he have to do? He has to pay capital gains tax. There's been a lot of gain, so he pays capital gains tax, assuming he's held these properties for longer than 12 months. The capital gain tax is about, say, 22.5%. Now, he knows that if he or she sells this property, he or she will want to maybe go and buy another property, or if you look at it that way, you've actually lost 22.5% after making a lot of money over the decades. But this looming bill of the capital gains tax will make people not want to sell, although they completely believe in this scenario where they're going to take everything away from us that is leveraged, and or whether you have all the other securities, all the numbers on the screen will be wiped. So you'll own nothing, but apparently you'll be happy. So they're not going to do it. They'll just sit on it thinking, well, I'm stuck. Hopefully it doesn't happen. It may not happen. I'm not saying it will, but if you're convinced that it will happen, you actually don't have an exit plan. Almost nobody ever sells the property. Why people never sold the investment properties is that if they realize their capital gains and they have to pay the capital gains tax, they realize that if they are to go and buy another property, even without the great taking, putting that into consideration without the great taking. They know that if they sell and go buy somewhere else, well, the prices have gone up everywhere else. They'll have to pay more than what they sold theirs for because they had to pay that tax. So bottom line is nobody sells it because they were sucked into this benefit of capital gains tax. So it's what they could do, and what if you truly fully believe in this, you'd sell those properties, settle the debt of the first one, and move on. Have that other property mortgage free. That would probably be a very extreme, very hard decision to make, but probably very smart thing to do. But they're not going to do it. So, not that they can even sell that property and buy into shares, because remember, the shares are not, according to this author, they're not owned by us. We are beneficial owners. We are not the owners of the property. So, or of those securities, or numbers on the screen. Ever since they changed the law and had these intermediary houses actually hold our shares, our numbers on the screen. Not to mention the cash in the bank has never been ours. We are unsecured customers, unsecured creditors that will get 0 or maybe 1 or 2% if the bank goes insolvent. So bottom line is, this has happened. It could very likely happen again. We're talking Great Depression style. Oh, it can't happen now. It's different. They're printing money. That's what they did in the 20s. They were printing money until they stopped, quote unquote, printing money. So they really didn't provide the liquidity that they were able to easily provide and avoid this Great Depression. The author talks about that. I'm not going to go into too much more detail, but you really need to read this book, or watch the documentary, or if you don't like to read, there are audio books available free on YouTube to listen to.